Hey everyone. So something a little bit different today. I'm not a professional linguist by a long shot, but recently I've been studying the phonological history of English, which is a super nerdy thing to do. And so just for a bit of nerdy fun, I decided to try my hand at reconstructing how Odin's name ought to be pronounced in modern English. And the result wasn't what I expected. So I thought I'd make a little video about it for anyone else who might be interested. I'm going to try and do this whole thing in one take, so it's probably going to be a little less polished than my podcast episodes, but we'll see how it goes. Anyways, let's start with this idea of how something ought to be pronounced. The word Odin is an anglicized borrowing taken from the Old Norse word Odin. There's nothing inherently wrong with borrowing in a loanword, but the only reason this word was borrowed into English in the first place is because the native English version of the same word had already fallen out of use centuries earlier. Essentially, Odin is a foreign replacement for a native word that had already been mostly lost. Keep in mind that Old English and Old Norse were related languages, and both of them descended from a common ancestor language that we call Proto-Germanic. And Proto-Germanic anciently had its own version of this same word, which was woðanas, and probably at least one other variation on this word, but we'll come back to that. Over time, as Proto-Germanic evolved and split into different language branches, versions of woðanas were carried along into each of them. In Old Norse, we ended up with Odin, and in Old English, we ended up with what is traditionally remembered as Woden. And just a quick note on the spelling here, that accent over the O in Odin and the little line over the O in Woden are both modern conventions indicating the same thing, which is that these are long vowels. And what that means is just that when you speak the word, you have to hold the vowel out a little longer when you say it. So for example, this is not Odin, it's Odin. And this is not Woden, it's Woden. There's also a universal notation system that exists for writing stuff like this, since different languages have different conventions, and that system is called the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. In IPA, a long O looks like this. Anything in IPA goes between two slashes, and these two little triangles after the vowel are how we indicate that it's a long vowel. You're going to be seeing a lot of this as we keep going forward here. Anyway, what these language relationships tell us is that the difference between Odin and Woden is a lot like the difference between Jesucristo and Jesus Christ. What we have is two names referring to the same person, but which are just spoken and spelled a little differently because the languages are a little different. This is how ancient Germanic people would have perceived these characters as well. But just to be super clear, Odin is not the same guy as Jesus. So, we know the word Woden existed in Old English because it shows up in Old English manuscripts. And in case you're wondering, that little letter that looks kind of like a P is actually not a P. It's a character called win that is just an old-fashioned way of writing the W sound. But anyway, due in no small part to the Christianization of England in the 600s AD, this word had fallen mostly out of use in the language by the Middle English period, which starts a little after the Norman invasion of 1066 AD. So already by that point, whenever somebody mentioned Woden the deity, they were, for the most part, borrowing that word back in from Old English writing, as opposed to, say, continuing a naturally evolved daily usage of a word that still existed in the common vernacular. So when I talk about reconstructing how Odin's name ought to be pronounced in modern English, I'm specifically referring to the way it would have been pronounced if it had never left the common vernacular and didn't need to be borrowed back in from an Old Norse or even Old English form. Instead, we want to figure out how this word would sound today if we had an unbroken through line all the way from Old English that allowed all the natural historical English sound changes to occur. This isn't any kind of value judgment on which words are right or wrong. It's just a fun thought experiment. So let's talk a little bit about some philology basics. In order to follow along with my reconstruction, you'll have to understand a few basic principles. But don't worry, I promise to keep everything very simple. As languages evolve over time, they do so in a way that follows describable patterns. If a given word changes in a given way, It's usually because an entire class of words matching similar criteria are all changing in the same way at the same time. Obviously, outliers and inconsistencies do occur, but unless we have some specific reason to believe any reconstructed word would have been an outlier, we have to reconstruct it assuming that it wasn't. There have been a ton of documented sound change rules that took us from Proto-Germanic all the way to modern English, but for now, we just need to go over a few that are the most important for reconstructing a modern version of Odin. So, starting with vowels. Vowels change for lots of reasons, and they change all the time really easily. If a vowel is long, meaning like I said before that it's held out a little longer when spoken, it can change differently than a short vowel that makes the same sound. If it's stressed, it can change differently than it would if it was unstressed. If it appears beside certain other consonants or vowels, it can change differently than if it didn't. Sometimes we even see changes to vowel pronunciations based on how many syllables a word has. In the case of Odin, we are dealing with a stressed long O appearing in a two-syllable word that does not contain any multi-consonant clusters. All these things matter because these are the basic conditions that govern how the vowels would have changed over time in this word. If these conditions were different, we would see different kinds of sound changes. One particular vowel change rule we need to understand is I mutation, also called I umlaut, but that doesn't really matter so much right now. It's actually not too hard to wrap your head around this. Basically, this is a change that happens when a vowel that lives in the back of the mouth, like ah or o, is followed by a syllable containing either of the sounds e or y, which both live all the way at the front of the mouth. And this is how we write those in IPA. So in order to reduce the effort it takes to pronounce a word like this, that back of the mouth vowel gets pulled a bit forward in the mouth towards these other sounds, and then that changes how it sounds. I mutation is the reason why we say foot in the singular and feet in the plural in English. In Proto-Germanic, these words were fots and fotis. They both have a long O, but you'll notice that in the plural version, the second syllable contains an I, which is going to trigger I mutation on that O. So let's walk through how this word evolves over time. Starting with the singular, we have fots, which later loses its grammatical suffix and becomes fot, and then later on the vowel gets raised to oo and the word becomes foot, and then finally in modern English that gets shortened to and we get foot. But in the plural version, something different happens. Because O lives in the back of the mouth, and the sound E, which we're spelling here with an I, lives in the front of the mouth, that O gets pulled forward, and fotis becomes thirties. Next, we lose the grammatical suffix, and because the vowel has a new sound, some different changes can start to apply. Later on, fert gets unrounded to fet, and finally in modern English, the vowel gets raised to feet. So that's I mutation. Basically, the presence of E or Y causes another vowel to change how it sounds, and then because it has a new sound, different things can happen to it over time. The next rule is called trisyllabic laxing, which is a really big word for a really simple thing that happened in English from around 900 to 1400 AD, where long vowels got shortened if they ended up in a word followed by two or more syllables. This is why we've ended up with words like south and southern, which both look like they have the same vowel in them, but are pronounced differently. So looking at this example, we start with Old English sooth, which has a funny letter in it that looks like a P but is actually called thorn and is an old-fashioned way of writing the TH sound. More importantly, it has a long oo sound in it. Over time, long oo in English changes to ow, and we end up with south. However, the Old English word for southern is suðurna, which has three syllables, and more specifically, it has a long oo followed by two or more syllables. So because of this, trisyllabic laxing kicks in, and this gets shortened to suðurna. Then, because this is now a short oo, it gets modified a little bit to southern, which is how a lot of people still say this word, especially, for example, up in northern England. But then in dialects like mine, there is one other rule that gets applied and changes this into southern. So again, because we have a rule shortening a vowel early on, it ends up sounding different in modern English. One other rule that can cause English long vowels to shorten is called pre-cluster shortening, and this happens when a long vowel falls just before certain clusters of consonants. But in pretty much all of the cases we're going to be looking at here, anywhere pre-cluster shortening would apply, trisyllabic laxing would also apply and give us the exact same result. So I'm going to be chalking most of these things up to trisyllabic laxing just to keep things simple. Okay, so the last rule we need to understand is called the great vowel shift. And in order to understand how this works, you have to understand that two of the things that affect why vowels sound different from each other is whether you pronounce them at the front of the mouth or the back of the mouth, and whether you pronounce them with your tongue lower down or higher up in the mouth. This little chart here illustrates how a few different vowels are positioned. There are obviously a lot more vowels than just these that exist, but these are the ones that get affected by the great vowel shift. So in the front, we have a, e, and e, and in the back, we have o, and u. So what happens is that between 1400 and 1600 AD, all of the long vowels get raised to fill the position just above them. And then these two that were already at the top have to get out of the way somehow, so they become diphthongs, which means that they each became a combination of two vowels. E became I, and U became ow. So going back to our example of the word feet, what happens is that this word is pronounced feet in Middle English, and when the great vowel shift occurs, it gets raised to feet. At the same time, the Middle English word pronounced biete had to get out of the way, and so it became bite. The great vowel shift is a big part of the reason why English words are spelled so weird. In large part, our words are spelled the way they sounded in Middle English, and the spelling system hasn't been reformed to compensate for other changes that have happened since then. For our purposes, what we really care about are these two changes here. Long e gets raised to e, and long o gets raised to u. These are very consistent sound changes. All right, so even though people had mostly stopped talking directly about the old pagan gods by the Middle English period, some of their names had worked their way into other parts of the language that remained in use. The most prominent case is the word thunder, which is quite literally the native English version of the name Thor. Apart from this, there are English weekdays and English place names that contain ancient Germanic theonyms. In our case, we need to turn our focus to the word Wednesday, which is the day belonging to Wedden, or so we might assume. There is also a decently sized list of locations in England ostensibly bearing this god's name that we can use to help us in our analysis, but we need to be careful with the place names because some of them are of disputed origin, and we can't be absolutely sure that 100% of them actually derive from Woden's name. Anyways, in Old English, the day we call Wednesday is attested as Woden'sday, Woden's Day, with an O. As far as I'm aware, there are no surviving written attestations of a corresponding Wednesday with an E in Old English. However, by the time we get to the Middle English period, we do see both forms, attested as Wednesday, Woden'sday, and with various different kinds of spellings. As of today, the E form has won out, and Wednesday has become the standard across the entire English-speaking world. Now here's where things get interesting. The only way English vowels historically changed from O to E is by a process involving I mutation, and the word Woden cannot trigger I mutation because it doesn't contain E or Y. What this means is that wedness cannot be derived from wodeness. The fact that the E form exists at all means it must have come from a different Old English form that had already undergone I mutation at an earlier stage. It's possible this different form could have been commonly spelled with an O, but if so, it still had to have been pronounced more like wordness. We know the sound existed in Old English for lots of reasons. In fact, there's even an Anglo-Saxon rune for it called the Öthel rune, which is different from the rune signifying O, which is called the Os rune. But when the Latin alphabet was adopted, this sound had to be represented in other ways. So we know that this Woden form must have existed in Old English, but what's crazy is it's actually impossible for this to be derived from the commonly accepted Proto-Germanic form of Odin's name because it can't trigger I mutation either. Notice that there is no E or Y sound anywhere after that long O in Wothenaz. So here's what scholars think is going on. Back in the Proto-Germanic period, there seems to have been a few different versions of this word floating around. We have, for example, Wothenaz, which is the form required to eventually give us Wodan in Old High German, Odin in Old Norse, and the O form of Woden in Old English. But something weird seems to be going on with that vowel in the middle there, because we're pretty sure there was also another form with an I, pronounced Wothinaz, which is what we need in order to trigger I mutation and give us this middle form of Woden, which eventually turns into Weden in later Old English and Old Frisian. So we end up with a situation where there is some dialectical variation in Old English, where by the end of the Old English period, we can safely say that some people would have been saying Woden and others would have been saying Weden. And we can confirm this because we get spellings of Wednesday with both an O and an E in Middle English. And as a possible confirmation of this Wothinaz form with an I, there's actually a rune stone called the Strangnes stone, which, assuming it's not a forgery and can actually be dated to the 500s, even has this I form written on it. There are also a bunch of place names based on this E form scattered across England. I know I'm going to say some of these wrong, but we have Wensbury, what looks like Wensfield but is actually pronounced Wedgefield, two separate Wensleys, a Wensleydale, a Wensham or maybe Wensham, and Wembury, which is in Devon and is the only one not located in northern or central England. And that might provide a hint as to where this I mutated E form was anciently the most popular. But more importantly, we now have enough information to actually be confident in a reconstruction of this word as it would have been spoken in modern English if it had never been lost. Old English Woden contained a long sound, and when it was unrounded to Weden in later Old English, that vowel stayed long. In the Middle English period, this vowel would have taken on a spelling of double E, which was usually designed to represent a long vowel sound. And then later, when the great vowel shift kicked in, the vowel would have been raised to E, thus giving us the final form, Weeden, spelled with a double E. But if the name should be Weeden, why do we say Wednesday and not Wednesday? Well, the answer to that is trisyllabic laxing. In Old English, this was a three-syllable word, pronounced Wednesday. And actually, so was every single attested place name that incorporates the name Weden into it. So in that context, a long vowel followed by two or more syllables, Wednesday, gets shortened to Wednesday, which becomes Wednesday in Middle English, and then finally Wednesday in Modern English. This is the same rule that gives us South and Southern, Holy and Holiday, and Weeden and Wednesday if the name had survived into Modern English. And at this point, I can almost hear you saying yuck through the screen of your device. And if you are, it's because our modern English ears have, for some strange reason, decided that the high vowels E and U are the goofy or childish vowels. Babies go pee-pee and poo-poo, weak people are weenies who get boo-boos instead of injuries, and this context makes Weeden sound sort of silly. But in reality, there are plenty of E words that don't bother us. For example, we might read about peace out at sea, while feeling free and speaking through our teeth like heathens. I think the reality is that if Weeden was actually part of the common vernacular, it wouldn't sound weird at all. We'd be used to it. In any case, I don't believe there are any other sound change rules that would cause this vowel to shorten or shift anywhere else on its own. It's not unstressed, it doesn't precede a consonant cluster, and it comes from Middle English instead of which is treated differently. The E form also historically beat out the competing O form in the only word wherein this name persists in the daily use of English speakers worldwide. So it may be safe to conclude that this is our best candidate for a ubiquitous modern form of the word. You can, of course, say Woden or even Weden instead of Weeden if you want. I'm not telling you to change the words you use, but if you were looking for a reconstructed, unborrowed form, this is probably what it would be. But it does beg the question, what if the O form had never died out? Believe it or not, there are still places in the world where people use naturally evolved forms of otherwise obsolete words like thou and thee. Here's an example I took from a YouTube video of a woman reading a poem in the Lancashire dialect. There are also places where people say things like crayfish and other places where they say crawdad. Not everybody speaking the same language has to use the same form of every word. And this was true for Odin's name in Old English. We know some people were saying Woden while others were saying Woden, for example. So even though we've done a reconstruction on the E form, what would we get if we'd never lost the O form either? There are lots of British place names ostensibly named after Woden that don't use the E form. I'm going to say some of these wrong too, I'm sure, but examples include places such as Wambrook, Wansdyke, two separate Wamboroughs, a Wampool, Wanstead, Wanston, Wormshill or maybe Wormshill, a few places containing the particle wood, which tends to have a disputed origin, and even one or two on-the-nose places like Woden's Barrow, which makes me think these are probably later renamings because they don't follow the rules. But the way these names are spelled doesn't really matter that much because the first vowels in, for example, Wanston and Wanstead are both pronounced ah. In the transition from Middle to Modern English, short O generally shifted to short ah, which is why words like stop and lock sound the way they do. More importantly, however, we know that many of these words do indeed derive from Woden because we see it in their attested Old English spellings. And the reason their initial vowels are short is, again, because of trisyllabic laxing, and or maybe precluster shortening. All of these place names contained at least 3 syllables in earlier times, which would have shortened Woden to Woden, thus allowing the shift from O to A later on in all of these multisyllable compounds. So in this case, again, it turns out that these place names can't actually tell us about how this word ought to sound when standing on its own. So let's do another reconstruction following the rules we know. We start with Old English Woden, which takes on a spelling of double O in Middle English. But then the great vowel shift kicks in, raising O to U, and we end up with a modern form pronounced Wooden. This is the exact same process that takes us from Old English words like pole and toth to the modern English words pool and tooth. Unfortunately, it's another word with a high vowel that, for me at least, strikes the ear a little bit weird when I first hear it. Wooden. However, in this case, there's actually one more layer of complexity. Right on the heels of the great vowel shift, another sound change started popping up in English that inconsistently shortened some instances of long oo down to short when it appeared before the sounds d, k, t, or either of the sounds made by th. This is why Old English words like foot, god, and boke ultimately became modern English foot, good, and book. But the inconsistency is why we don't see the same change happening with a word like tooth. And actually, we can observe a similar real-time thing happening in English today if we look at a word like root, which was borrowed into Old English as rot from Old Norse. In most modern dialects, this word is pronounced root, but in Midwestern American English, it's been shortened to root. Anyway, because this rule was only inconsistently applied, we can't know for sure whether it would have been applied to our reconstructed Wooden. If it had, this name would have become Wooden, in which case it would have become a homonym with the other word wooden that means made out of wood. They would have had the same sound and the same spelling, but different meanings. So what we can say pretty confidently is that there would have been a stage where this name was pronounced Wooden, but we can only guess at whether it would have also evolved into wooden because we don't have any solid evidence pointing either way. As a quick side note, for anyone familiar with the foot strut split that takes the sound and turns it into in some dialects, it's worth noting that this rule wouldn't apply to the name wooden because the foot strut split does not apply after labial consonants like W. So in case you were wondering, we don't need to worry about that here. In any case, I've just claimed that we don't have any solid evidence that anyone would have used the pronunciation of wooden instead of wooden. So this brings us to the curious case of Woodensborough. which is a village in the county of Kent in southeastern England, and has a name whose spelling seems to defy all logic at face value. I bring it up here because I've seen some people claim online that the way Woodensborough is pronounced is evidence that Woden might have become wooden in modern English. So let's talk about that. Wikipedia will tell you, because a guy named Hasted in 1800 wrote, that in modern times this name has sometimes been pronounced Winsborough. But if you happen to live there, or if you bother to search for a video of someone local actually saying this word in the 21st century, you'll discover that the pronunciation often seems much closer to the spelling, Woodensborough. Interestingly, spelling doesn't typically influence pronunciation, so it's unlikely that everyone used to say Winsborough and then decided to move closer to the way it's spelled, Woodensborough. Instead, it's more likely that both of these pronunciations existed historically. And if I had to make a guess, I would guess that the Woodens version was probably used by the more educated class and is now winning out over the Wins version because education has become more available over time. But if both pronunciations existed historically, then Wins is probably derived from Woodens. And there are attestations of this name written way back in 1100 and 1484 AD that both incorporate the name Woden, so we know that that's our starting point. What's a little bit tricky to explain is how we get from Wodeness to Woodens and then to Wins. There's no documented sound change rule I could find that explains this, so I had to come up with my own theory. And that theory involves this name here, which looks like Wensfield, but is actually pronounced Wedgefield. What appears to be going on here is that the whole cluster wedness has been smashed right up against the front of the mouth, apparently to reduce effort in saying a long word quickly, and that results in some of these consonants getting palatalized, which changes the pronunciation. Now, in this case, the E range of vowels is already in the front of the mouth, so when all of these other sounds are pushed forward and jammed up against the palate, there isn't a lot of pressure for this vowel to move anywhere. But if we imagine this same process of multi-syllable triggered front of the mouth smashing is occurring in the name Woodensborough, then what we may be seeing is something like this. The vowel is just a little bit further forward in the mouth than O, and the vowel I is even further forward than that. So as the original cluster Wodness starts getting pushed forward and reduced, the vowel gets pushed forward as well, and we get Woodens. And then, as some people push it even further forward and reduce it even more, the vowel comes along for the ride, and we get Wins. This is just my own theory, but I have been unable to find any broader sound change rule that would result in the existence of these forms, given their origin. However, my theory can't explain why the word is spelled with a double O, which is a convention that was typically used for long vowels, here in a situation where trisyllabic laxing has actually given us a short vowel. Figuring this out probably requires a highly detailed understanding of Kentish spelling and speech nuances over time, which I don't have. Though I guess it could be as simple as Kent just having conservative spelling conventions that weren't reformed when vowels shortened. But even if my theory is wrong, and regardless of why this word is spelled with a double O, what we have in this word is a short vowel. And the reason we have a short vowel here, as I mentioned, is again the result of trisyllabic laxing and/or precluster shortening. Two rules that would have all but certainly affected the name only when it appeared in the compound and not when it appeared on its own. This means Woodensborough can't be the result of the inconsistent shortening of oo to that gave us words like foot and soot. That process operated on long vowels between 1600 and 1725, and trisyllabic laxing would have already shortened this vowel by 1500. So in light of that, I don't believe Woodensborough can tell us anything about whether or not Woden would have ever been shortened to wooden when standing on its own. If we think it might have been, it's still just a guess. Okay, so there's one last thing I want to talk about though, and that is the frequency with which we find short vowels in names and other proper nouns that had long vowels in them in Old English. I've seen it claimed online that this is actually its own independent sound change rule, but to be clear, there is no documented sound change rule, at least not that I could find anywhere after searching high and low, that describes vowels shortening in the context of proper nouns. Instead, we can take a look at any modern name you like that had a long vowel in Old English, and explain why that vowel is short in the modern version through other recognized processes. So let's take a look at a few examples of how that works. We'll start with Alfred, which comes from Old English Alfrad. In this case, what we're seeing is a documented rule called vowel reduction in unstressed syllables. In this word, the stress lands on the first syllable, alf. So people got a little lazy with the second syllable and the vowel got shortened. Next, we have the name Cuthbert, which comes from Old English Cuthbert. This time what we're seeing is that pre-cluster shortening rule I keep alluding to. The long oo is followed by a consonant cluster, in this case thorn and b, that is documented to trigger shortening of a preceding vowel. The next one's a little trickier because it involves a chain of two sound change rules that ended up turning Old English Eadwerd into modern English Edward. The first change is that the diphthong of long e followed by a was consistently monophthongized to long e. Later, pre-cluster shortening was triggered by the combination dw, which reduced it down further to e. Now, this last one took me a little bit of time to figure out, because at first glance, it looks like modern English Goodwin is derived from Old English Godwinna, but actually that isn't correct. The correct modern derivation is Godwin. Goodwin actually comes from Old Norse Guðvinr, which already had a short u. So from here, standard sound change rules applied that turned u into It's the same way that we got from Old English wudu to modern English would. In the end, I feel pretty confident that there are actually no other nuanced sound change rules that can be applied to the forms I've reconstructed here that would cause them to change to any other form. As I mentioned in the beginning, though, I'm not an expert. So if any of you are aware of something I missed, please feel free to let me know so I can make a correction. But to close things out here, I've decided to write an incredibly cringy poem that ties all of our conclusions here together. And here it is. If an E-form itch is what you're feedin', it's safe to say you're stuck with weedin'. But if I-umlaut seems too intrudin', you may just have to go with woodin'. Unless, of course, you don't mind guesses in reconstructive tangled tresses. In that case, bake your English puddin' with a grain of salt and a dash of wooden. Anyways, I wanted to give a special thanks to all my friends online that helped me get my head wrapped around this topic and challenged some of my conclusions as I was working through it. There are some very helpful people on the Norse Discord, the Anglish subreddit, the Old English subreddit, and even the Linguistic subreddit. You are all awesome. And to everyone else, thanks for watching. See you again next time.